Out here, everything feels calm until it isn't. Stories like this don't always make the news, but they leave marks all the same. Let me tell you one of them. Before we start today's story, I want you to imagine something very specific. I want you to imagine standing outside at night, in the mountains, in the snow. There's no wind, no traffic, no animals. It's the kind of silence where even your breathing feels loud. Now imagine that somewhere nearby, something truly violent is happening, and you don't hear a single thing. That's the silence this story lives in. And once you understand how quiet it really was, everything else becomes a lot more disturbing. This story takes place in early April of 1981 in Northern California. And before you imagine beaches and sunshine, stop. This part of California is nothing like that. We're talking about high elevation mountains, thick pine forests, narrow roads, and long winters. Even in April, snow still covered the ground. And when it snowed up here, it didn't just fall, it stayed. The town was called Keddy, and calling it a town is being generous. Keddy was basically a bend in the road with a few dozen cabins scattered through the trees. No police station, no hospital, no streetlights, just cabins, snow, and people who trusted each other. And that trust is important, because whoever committed this crime didn't stand out. They blended in. People didn't lock their doors in Keddy, not because they were careless, but because nothing ever happened there. Kids ran between cabins without supervision. Neighbors borrowed sugar without asking. If you saw someone walking at night, you probably knew who they were. And if you didn't, that would have stuck out immediately. Which makes what happened in Cabin 28 so unsettling. Because this crime didn't feel like it came from outside. It felt like it came from within. The cabin sat slightly apart from the others. Not hidden, not isolated, just far enough that it felt quiet. Wood siding, small porch, snow banked up against the foundation. It wasn't run down. It wasn't creepy. It was just a normal cabin. And that's exactly why what happened inside is so hard to process. Because this wasn't some abandoned shack in the woods. This was someone's home. Living in Cabin 28 was Sue Sharp, a single mother with 5 children. Sue wasn't running from the law. She was running from a life that had worn her down. She had recently left an abusive relationship. She wanted a fresh start, somewhere quiet, somewhere affordable, somewhere safe. And on the surface, Keddy seemed perfect. Sue worked hard. She was friendly but private, protective of her kids. People liked her. But here's the thing. Starting over doesn't mean your past disappears. Sometimes it follows quietly. Sue's kids were exactly what you'd expect. Loud, messy, always coming and going. They knew the area. They knew the neighbors. And on April 11th, 1981, the night started like any other. No arguments, no threats, no sense of danger. Which matters, because it tells us something critical. No one inside Cabin 28 thought they were at risk. That night, Sue's 2 youngest boys were staying overnight at a neighbor's cabin. This wasn't unusual. Inside Cabin 28 were 4 people: Sue, her teenage son John, her younger son Dana, and Dana's friend, Dana Wingate, who was sleeping over. They ate food, they watched TV, they relaxed. The television would remain on all night. That detail comes back later. At some point during the night, someone entered Cabin 28. There was no forced entry, which means one of 2 things. The door was unlocked, or someone inside opened it willingly. Either way, whoever came in wasn't immediately seen as a threat, and that's terrifying. Investigators believe Sue Sharp and Dana Wingate were attacked first. They were beaten with a blunt object. Not once, not quickly, The injuries were severe, the kind that suggest overwhelming anger. This wasn't panic. This was rage. Meanwhile, the boys were restrained. Someone took time to tie them up. That detail matters because it shows planning. It shows control. This wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was something unfolding step by step. After being tied up, the boys were stabbed multiple times. The medical examiner later described the wounds as excessive. This wasn't about killing someone quickly. This was about making sure. And that distinction is important because it points to something personal. One of the boys didn't die immediately. He lived for hours, long enough to free himself, long enough to crawl across the floor, long enough to reach his brother. And then he died, alone, in the dark, with the television still playing. That detail alone has haunted investigators for decades. There was another child inside cabin 28 that night. Sue's youngest daughter, Tina. She was asleep in her bedroom. She wasn't attacked. She wasn't restrained. She didn't wake up. Whoever committed these murders walked past her room and chose not to kill her. That decision is one of the most disturbing parts of this case, because it was a decision. The next morning, one of Sue's younger sons returned from the neighbor's cabin. He walked into cabin 28 and immediately sensed something was wrong. The smell, the silence. Then he saw the bodies, covered with blankets, blood dark against the floor. The TV still on, like the night never ended. When police arrived, they expected the snow to explain everything. Fresh snow preserves footprints perfectly, except there were none. No tracks approaching the cabin, no tracks leaving it. Just smooth, untouched snow, which leads to terrifying possibilities. The killer lived close enough to avoid leaving tracks. The killer knew how to move carefully through snow. Or the killer waited, watching, until snowfall erased everything. None of those options are comforting. Police immediately suspected someone local, and that made sense. This wasn't random, but the investigation quickly unraveled. Evidence was mishandled. Blood samples disappeared. Witnesses weren't properly questioned. And then, unbelievably, the cabin was cleaned and rented out before the case was solved, before justice, before answers. Potential evidence was destroyed forever. Over the years, several suspects emerged. None were convicted, but none were ever fully cleared. Sue's ex-husband had a violent history. He had motive, he had anger, and he reportedly made disturbing comments after the murders. But he had an alibi, and no physical evidence ever tied him to cabin 28. A man living nearby was known for erratic behavior. He knew the cabin layout. He knew the family. Years later, a cassette tape surfaced. On it, two men argued. They talked about the murders. They talked about things going wrong. They talked about someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Many believe they were referring to Tina. The tape was never officially used. Why? That answer depends on who you ask. Some investigators believe this crime involved multiple people. It explains the bindings, the silence, the lack of footprints. Multiple attackers means coordination. Coordination means planning. Years later, cabin 28 was torn down, completely removed, like someone thought destroying the building might destroy the memory. It didn't. People who grew up in Getty still talk about it. They say the area feels wrong, like the trees remember, like the snow listened. So if you ever find yourself somewhere quiet, somewhere cold, somewhere snow makes everything feel muted, just remember, silence doesn't mean safety. Sometimes, it just means no one survived long enough to make a sound.